Cloud. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for the third of the Northeast Cover Crop Council short webinars. I'm Victoria Ackroyd. I'm the program manager for the Northeast Cover Crops Council, and my co-host is Susan Brulette, who works at University of Vermont Extension. Today's session qualifies for 0.5 crop management CCA CEUs. We will put up the slide at the end of the presentation, along with the QR code that you need to use to register that you attended. This talk's going to be about 20 minutes long, and there will be about 10 minutes at the end for questions. Please feel free to throw questions into the chat as they come up. This webinar is being recorded. We're also doing the whole closed captioning thing for anyone who wants that. The webinar and the slides will be available on the University of Vermont Extension website after this talk. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Kate Brown. Kate is an agricultural agent with Rutgers Cooperative Extension and an NECCC board member. She received her MS in horticulture from Cornell University in 2022 and a BS in plant science from Rutgers University in 2018. As an undergrad, she researched fescues for blueberry row middles. So very cool research project there. Her work now focuses on assisting commercial growers in production, improving soil health, and addressing on-farm safety. She launched online programming such as the Homesteading Academy to connect with Extension clientele during the height of the COVID pandemic. Kate, thank you for speaking today. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Are you seeing the reverse option there?
We appear to be there we go. It's in presentation mode.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we can go ahead and get started. When we started brainstorming ideas for this webinar series, I thought about this question of, which is better, winter wheat or cereal rye? The reason was that I often see this come up in cover crop forums, people asking the end all be all answer, which is better. And I think there's a lot at play. So I wanted to explore that today in these short little lunchtime talks, and I thought it was a great forum to do so. I'm sure everyone here probably has their own experience to share as well, so I'd be happy to get into that once I wrap up the presentation. So for today's agenda, I wanted to start by introducing the two species that we'll be talking about. I wanted to explain some of the selection criteria that you might use, not just for these two cover crops, but for cover cropping in general. And then I wanted to follow along the season, basically from planting to termination, to talk about where these two species diverge in their growth habit and characteristics that might impact your cropping system. Mention some special considerations that might apply to you and give a little bit of a summary. So cereal rye and winter wheat are very similar species. They are both winter annual grasses with a similar seed size, although there can be quite a range in the seed per pound, and also a similar growth habit, both being modeled after this cereal growth stage chart that we see here at the bottom. So when we talk about some considerations for species selection, I wanted to use our Northeast Cover Crop Council crop selector tool as a model. So I'll share a QR code to this after we go through the considerations, but first we'll begin with the site conditions. Of course, you want to think about the site, the soil characteristics on your particular farm or on your particular piece of ground. Certainly soil type can vary, pH and fertility, or even the frequency of drought and flooding incidents. Frost date, of course, the length of your growing season comes into play, and how that ties into your cash crop growing window, it can be very important for your cover crop selection. And also precipitation timing and amount. If you know that you're prone to drought or excessive rain at certain periods of time, that might impact when you seed and therefore impact the choices that you have available to you. As I mentioned, cash crop growing window is another important piece to consider. For example, you might be growing field corn, whether you're growing it for silage or grain, could significantly impact the period of time that you have to plant, whether you're pulling that silage off early or waiting several weeks later to pull off the grain. Or maybe you have a late season crop like pumpkin, something that you can't get into with a piece of equipment. Maybe you're considering type of aerial seeding. We're doing some drone seeding in pumpkin here. But the crop that you have and the growing window for that can affect your decision. So here I've pulled out from the species selector tool. This red part indicates a growing window for a hypothetical crop. Perhaps soybean was in my mind here. And we see that the two species that we're talking about today, the effective growing window is available after we pull those soybeans off. However, cereal rye has a little bit of a longer window than wheat, and that's something that we'll talk about. And lastly, the goals. It's very important to establish why you're intending to plant a cover crop, and that can help determine the species that you'll ultimately choose. So here are, the complete list of goals that we provide in the selector tool. We ask that you select 3, and ultimately when you get to the end and you view your list of species, you'll be able to compare these directly. Here is where you can find all of our decision tools. However, that information is specifically from the species selector tool. So now let's just go through the growing season and try to look at where these two species start to diverge from each other and where those might be beneficial or consequential for your production system. So cereal rye, for sure, has the longest planting window because it can germinate as long as the temperature is 34 degrees Fahrenheit. So that gives a lot of flexibility when we talk about our traditional drilling of seed after you pull the crop off. And it can also has like the greatest tolerance for poor soils, whether it be low fertility or acidic soils. And Victoria mentioned I got my start looking at cover crops in blueberry production systems. Our soil pH in the blueberry system was at best 4.5 in the field I was working in. And here's the photo of the cereal rye crop that we were able to produce on that very sandy, droughty soil. So, it's not the best rye that you'll ever see, but it was definitely one of the few choices that we had available to us in that challenging, low fertility, acidic soil that we were working with there. There's a wide seeding range for both of these species. There can be a lot that comes into play there, whether it's seeding time, seeding method, or your ultimate goals. Maybe you'll increase the seeding rate significantly if you're planning to plant directly into it, or if you're using it for using that residue for weed control. Or maybe you'll cut back if you're incorporating it in a mix, or if you're planting early enough that these species can get a lot of biomass on them before the end of the season. Again, we just illustrate here that winter wheat has less of a tolerance when it comes to pH range, and also requires a slightly higher temperature to germinate, therefore cutting back on our ultimate planting window. When it comes to overwintering and ultimately the establishment of the crops, cereal rye is the most cold hardy of our cereal grains, including winter wheat. So this species can continue to grow through a minimum temperature of 38 degrees. So we're getting more biomass on these species longer into the fall and even into the winter in some cases. This photo is just an illustration to show you 100 pounds of drilled rye on the left and 100 pounds of drilled wheat on the right. You can see the significant more ground cover from the cereal rye as opposed to the wheat. And this has implications when it comes to weed management. We find that cereal rye is really significantly better at winter annual weed control compared to winter wheat or other winter cover crops. When spring comes around and we get green up and these plants start to actively grow again, because cereal rye can grow at a lower base temperature, we see that it starts to grow earlier in the spring and ultimately mature earlier as well. So this can be beneficial for certain cropping systems where you might be trying to plant directly into that residue. And so you get a plant that matures earlier, and you're ultimately able to plant maybe your field corn or soybeans into that earlier as well. However, this can be a problem because you have less of a window for management. So you have a plant that's growing rapidly, needs to be managed in a timely manner. And if you're not able to do that, then you ultimately end up possibly with more biomass than you're looking for, or the plants may even start to set seed. I remember conversations on the board calls, perhaps last year. There were several states and growers unable to get in and terminate their cereal rye. And it really led to problems with their planting, just because of frequent spring rains. They couldn't get in to manage it. In other cases, it could be beneficial to have this significant growth in the spring. You're getting a lot of moisture use out of this cover crop, which is a very vigorous species, which can, depending on your site, improve the planting conditions. Maybe you have a little bit of a wet site, or you do have those frequent rains, and you're fortunate enough to be able to pull some of that water out and create a better condition for planting. However, if your site is prone to drought, or you are unlucky and with a dry year, then this can really lead to dry conditions at planting and ultimately impact your germination and establishment rates. Again, cereal rye can get up to 6 feet tall. You may have even seen it taller than that. So it's really a lot of biomass to handle in the spring. But on the other hand, winter wheat is later to mature. So again, it gives us a longer window of time to be able to manage it. And it's also just a plant that produces less biomass and is less tall. So it can be more flexible in that way if you're concerned about the biomass management when it comes to rye. Now, at termination, in some cases, growers are able to get dry matter production over 10,000 pounds per acre. That is a significant amount of biomass and can be really beneficial if you are prepared to deal with it. But this might be a reason why some growers opt to use winter wheat. Less overall biomass production makes it a little bit easier to manage. So there's that trade-off of biomass production and weed control, which is something that you'll have to consider as you consider both of these species. The termination strategies are similar among cereal rye and winter wheat. Either you're going to plan to terminate it before elongation with a herbicide, or perhaps you'll wait for that species to mature all the way up to anthesis or flowering and go in there again with a herbicide. You may even mow it or roller crimp it, which is a very common practice. After termination, there are also it's also variable between these two species and their impacts on both the soil and the cropping system after they're terminated. We know that they have similar benefits for soil health. These, even though there is this disparate growth in biomass, it is a substantial amount of biomass from both cover crops if they're allowed to get to maturity, both above ground and below ground. So they have similar benefits for soil health. However, we know that cereal rye residue is more persistent. I've included a photo here from it was one of my colleagues that took this at a farm up in North Jersey, where they grew a significant crop of cereal rye. They roller crimped it and planted pumpkins on it, and you cannot see light through that mat, even in the late fall when you're getting ready to harvest these pumpkins. So this species has very persistent residue and can do excellent things for weed control, or in this case, also keeping soil off pumpkins, helping with disease control, and it's used in many other cropping systems in this way. However, wheat is, one important thing about wheat is that it is less likely to become weedy through reseeding. Again, that rye can get away from you and it can start to produce viable seed and ultimately become a problem in your cropping system. And if you don't have the adequate tools to manage that volunteer rye, or I've seen it even called feral rye, then you're going to be in trouble if you're late in managing that rye as compared to wheat. Some special things to consider would be, again, thinking, this is more of a summary question, but thinking about how does the cover crop fit into your ultimate crop rotation? It's important for us to focus on soil health and incorporating cover crops into our system, but we need those cash crops to keep the farm viable. And so it's important to think about how your cover crop management will impact your cash crop. Specifically, how and when will you terminate your cover crop? Because the implications that biomass can have on the cash crop can be significant, either positive or negative, depending on your actions. Also wondering, do you intend to use this cover crop as a single species, a monoculture planting, or as part of a mix? There's a lot of interest in multi-species cover crop mixes. And these species, rye and wheat may have different implications for different decisions there. So when it comes to your termination strategy, here's just some things I wanted to parse out about the differences between rye and wheat. When it comes to biomass production, controlling those spring and summer weeds is an essential benefit of rye. This is one of the main reasons that people grow this plant, and they grow it big and tall, like you see in the bottom photo, and they might plant right into it, is getting control of, or helping with the control of spring and summer weeds. However, if you are going in the early spring and terminating, whether it be rye or wheat, this really takes away from the benefit that you get out of rye. So perhaps if you're planning to terminate early, there's less of a significant difference between these two cover crop species. Additionally, if you do delay your termination to maturity of these plants, you get a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. The straw from these species has a similar carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that can result in nitrogen tie-up in the soil. So depending on your crop, particularly, field corn comes to mind, this could be a concern. However, as we discussed, wheat has a longer management window. So you're less likely to be fighting a very mature plant if there are any challenges that come with termination a little bit earlier. And with cereal rye, there is always the consideration about the allelopathic effects, which contribute to the weed control efficacy of that species, but may also have negative impacts for the crop that you're growing. When we think about how these species perform in a mix, if you're thinking about growing in a mix, you might want to look at our seeding rate calculator, which is hosted on the Precision Sustainable Ag website. You can go to the QR code here. That's at the top right of the screen. Select your state, and the appropriate cover crop council database will be used to formulate these mix ratios based on your system. So I just threw this example in here. We often see interest in a 3-species mix, a legume, a brassica, and a grass or winter cereal. And you can see here that based on that vigor that we get out of cereal rye, we have to cut back the seeding rate significantly compared to what we did for winter wheat, despite their similar seed size and growth habits. So this is one of the cool tools that's being hosted on the Precision Sustainable Ag site, and there's multiple others I encourage you to check out. So I thought it was appropriate to assign some superlatives to these cover crops. I felt that cereal rye here on the left would be, most likely to succeed. It's the most commonly grown cover crop for a reason. It's reliable. It has that wide, longer planting window that we have in the fall, so it can be used after most crops. It's very vigorous, excellent for winter and spring weed control. And it's just an old standby that is most likely to succeed. However, winter wheat perhaps might be the best team player. You do lose a little bit with a little bit of opportunity because you don't have as great of a fall planting window, but the advantages when it comes to the springtime management might make it fit into your cropping system a little easier. less biomass to handle, about longer window for management, being a little bit less vigorous if you do decide to use it in a mix. So this is more of a more tame species to be dealing with. So perhaps the best team player. So in summary on these two species, I'm sure you've heard this before, but I think, next to the definition of workhorse is a photo of cereal rye. It has the greatest adaptability among our winter cereal cover crops, and also the biomass production is substantial compared to winter wheat or really any winter cover crop. Perhaps this species would be best to use where your focus is on the soil health parameters, nutrient scavenging, erosion prevention, weed suppression, as we talked about, and also building soil organic matter. Whereas winter wheat is a little bit less competitive, has a longer management window, and would be a good choice where you're concerned about your spring management opportunities. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And also happy to hear about your own experiences because this seems to come up a lot and it seems to be very site specific. So thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Awesome presentation. I know sometimes we start to get into some of these things that look very similar and then you realize that you need a little help to figure out, which one might be the better choice. So at this point, you're certainly welcome to, click the raise hand button, just speak up, put your name in the chat, or not name, put your question in the chat. Clearly, I need to stop and eat lunch too, which might be what a fair number of people are doing. But we do have a few minutes for questions. So I have a question.
Oh boy.
You're up in New Jersey and you worked in blueberry systems. So you have experience with maybe some more difficult type growing conditions. I know New Jersey's dealing with saltwater intrusion too in some areas. I personally am on a heavy clay. Any thoughts on what of the legumes you would pick for use on a heavy clay? Or should I use the species selector tool?
Yeah, I mean, the species selector tool, the great thing about the species selector tool is it has that input from people across multiple sites and locations. I mean, honestly, I'm getting used to heavier clay soils myself. I was working down in blueberry country, our coastal plain sandy soils of South Jersey. And it's amazing how going an hour north, where I'm now located in Somerset County in the north, the soil is completely different. We're on this Piedmont type soils, and it is heavier clay. I'm just spent the last 6 months learning about how our farmers are trying to deal with these different soil conditions. So I'm looking forward to the joint experiment where joining the joint experiment this year, looking at legumes on these type of soils at our research farm up here.
Yep. The results from previous cover crop council joint experiments will be discussed on a future webinar, which is what Kate's referring to, is the council does kind of a not low effort necessarily, but low cost joint research project each year, harnessing the ability of our council to provide multiple sites across from the far north to the mid-Atlantic to gain better insight into cover crop management. Any other questions? Okay, so Ken says, what about dormant versus non-dormant rye varieties? Most rye available comes from Canada or more northern regions and is winter dormant. Less available are non-dormant types like Abruzzi that start growing a couple weeks earlier. So dormant versus non-dormant. Almost sounds like winter versus spring rye.
Yeah, I guess I'm not familiar with the terminology. I would think at some point there's a level of dormancy from no matter what. I'm not, Victoria, do you have experience with those species or?
So in the species selector tool for some states and regions, we do have winter versus spring cereal rye. And for me, it's actually easier when I think about the wheat. You know how you've got winter wheat that tends to be a lot hardier. It needs to vernalize in order to flower and go to seed, versus the spring wheat, of course, that is not as cold tolerant and does not require vernalization for seeding. And so at least in the species selector tool, that's how we have divided it up in terms of winter versus spring, which maybe is what Ken is talking about. Ken, I don't know if you've got your audio up and working, but can you maybe elaborate? I know that like there are areas south of here where things don't go dormant simply because it doesn't stay cold long enough, like North Carolina with the wheat or the rye. Ken doesn't have audio. Ken, if you want to send us an email, we can try to maybe follow up with you after the call. I see that Pierre has a question about daikon radish. If you have audio, you're certainly welcome to speak up.
Okay, I'm here.
Hey.
Hi. So I planted daikon radish for the first time, to alleviate some compaction in my clay soils. It sounded like a great, and I haven't been through a winter with it yet. So in order to get that advantage, you've got to let it decompose in the soil. But it's going to seed, and I didn't think I wanted that. So I went ahead and clipped it. I'm in Maine, and this was about a month ago. And darned if it hasn't regrown its flowers. So I'm wondering, is this part of it kind of come with the territory? You got to put up with viable seed if you're going to have the benefits of the decomposing daikon radish root.
I'm curious about the fact that it's flowering in the fall.
There are viable seed heads, yes.
So
What,
how early, I didn't catch the first part of it. How early did you plant it?
Oh, this was probably June.
oh,
Oh, good golly, Miss Molly, no wonder.
Okay.
oh yeah.
Yeah, you most definitely have to be careful with radish, anything in the mustard family, really, to not plant it too early. But June isn't even in the fall. I mean, in theory, if you plant it early enough in the fall, like in August, it could also go to seed. But if you're planting it in June, you definitely need to terminate it unless you're not concerned about the risk of it going to seed.
If I want those root developments, I'm not going to get it. I'm not going to get it if I terminate it.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps it's different in the northern regions, but where I am, we are typically seeding the radish in late August or mid to late August, and allowing it to overwinter, letting that root growth happen in the fall. It overwinters, and if we're lucky, it winter kills. But I would think the same plan for the north up in Maine, but I would just expect a more reliable winter kill. I have to look at the Explorer tool to see about the seeding rate recommendation, or the seeding date recommendation for Maine. But I would think it would still be August.
For fall planted.
Yeah.
It sounds like the concern is that August might be too late for them to get a good root on it. And so I would definitely check. Our person in Maine is actually Jason Lilly, but it doesn't matter when you plant it. If it manages to get close to going to seed and you're concerned about it becoming a weed, you absolutely must get it out of the field before it succeeds in doing that. I mean, you can graze it. It doesn't take a lot to kill it mechanically if you don't want to use an herbicide, or unfortunately, pick another species.
I grazed it. The sheep like it.
Good, cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
So that, by all means, brings us to the end of this presentation. The slides and the recording will be posted when we have time on the University of Vermont website. Susan's usually pretty good about getting it up pretty quickly. So you can see on your screen, there's a QR code. If you need that CCA CEU, please go on ahead and follow the directions on your screen. Thank you all for attending today. I'm looking forward to next week's presentation, and hopefully some of you will join us for that one as well. And with that, I'm going to go on ahead and stop recording and say thank you, Kate, for speaking today. And there we go.